Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your working groups, and I'm so honored to have these three leaders on the stage today. The title of this session is Turning Talk into Action, and as Anita Hill said today, you can change all the rules you want, but if you don't have leadership, nothing is really going to change. And these leaders they're walking the walk in their organizations, and so let me introduce them briefly. Tony Profit, the first Chief Equity Officer at Salesforce, former executive at Microsoft and HP, and you were appointed in 2016 by Mark Benioff, who wanted you to focus not only on gender, but issues of race and LGBTQ as well.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Thanks. And Tim Ryan is chairman and senior partner of PwC and the founding signatory of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, which now has, if I'm correct, the latest numbers, 700 companies have signed. So we'll be hearing a lot more on this. And Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who in many ways is someone who has just, when people describe you, has done it all. Started in finance, went to tech, have been a founder, have been an executive at Google and Amazon, is now president of StubHub, and also has founded Board List, which is an organization that promotes women in boards. So thank you all for being here. I guess Tim, why don't you get us started? You had some news this week that some people have looked at these numbers of 700 and thought, that's great, but a pledge is a pledge. Where's the action? Where's the teeth? You decided to up the ante a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for caring enough to make your time and invest in this. Yesterday was a special day. It was the second anniversary of CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. When we launched, we had 112. If someone told me 2 years into it you'd have 700, I would have said no way. So we're very proud of the fact that we'll be able to make it this far. And the whole idea is the more we expose CEOs to the issue around inclusion and how to get each other better, we can do better as a business community. We have had some good successes over the last 2 years. We upped the ante yesterday on the second anniversary, and we asked every signatory to commit to not only writing down a diversity inclusion strategic plan, but also review it with the board. Why do we do that? We know, number one, what measures get done. We know, number one, if you put it down, then you're going to follow it. And we're trying to pull the board into the discussion because the board plays a critical role. So it was met with a lot of enthusiasm. We think it's the right step for the group.
Mm-hmm. Sukhinder, you've worked in tech organizations in particular your whole career, or almost your whole career. Tech doesn't really have a great reputation on these fronts. What do you think really is important for change at StubHub and organizations?
Well, first of all, between, I would say, StubHub and the Board List, I think that tech cannot really talk about solving the world's big problems if it can't be willing to apply technology to solving its own problems. So when I think about the tech ecosystem, first and foremost, both things can be true. It can be a meritocratic place and still a place that suffers from unconscious bias. I don't think it's an or, right? And keep in mind that tech is in the spotlight for lots of reasons. I don't even know that even means that it's worse than any other place, but I think it's about the fact that tech expects progress in so many areas and espouses, and I think quite rightly, a vision for innovation that I sort of feel like the innovation needs to be self-applied. That's my feeling on tech. Like, look, let's bring solutions back. And so obviously the Board List was really our first attempt to create a technology solution to the problem of women in boards by realizing that there was fragmented, lots of great women, a myth around the pipeline, but the need to aggregate amazing supply, we call it really great talent, female and diverse talent, and that the real problem in the boardroom is demand. And if you look at classic technology, you would say, well, aggregate supply to stimulate demand. And obviously that's what we built at the Board List, which is 3.5 years old. It's had, 3,000 to 4,000 women nominated to the platform. We have about almost 3,000 CEOs and board members who nominate onto the platform. We've had 1,200 companies, public and private, search on the platform, and we've influenced over 140 board placements to date. And so we're really trying to use technology to solve the problem. And that's my feeling of the tech industry in general. It's been a very good place for me personally, and it's a place where I see possibility every day. But I sort of believe it's also a place where, kind of as a pragmatist, I'm like, okay, can we just start talking about solutions? And more importantly, if we can think about solving problems around the world, we really ought to start with applying technology to our own backyard.
Tony, I want to ask you about pay equity. Salesforce became quite famous 2 or 3 years ago for implementing pay equity throughout the organization. Can you tell me, like, the story of how that happened? And you know, Salesforce just announced another multi-billion-dollar deal this week. How are you keeping it going?
Well, the equal pay story, it's one of the defining stories of Salesforce. And the company is just a little bit more than 20 years old. And so there's so many beautiful lessons in it. One of them is late in the story of the company. And the company was a decade and a half old or more when a couple leaders, Cindy Robbins, who led our version of HR, we call it employee success, Leila Seca, she was leader in our tech and product organization, came to the co-founder and then CEO, who's now co-CEO and chairman, Mark Benioff, and said, hey, there's a problem. We believe that women aren't paid the same as men. They didn't have all the data, but they had a strong hypothesis. And Mark empowered them to go off and get the data, and they audited the pay of every employee on the planet for parity and equity based on gender identity, and found that there was, in fact, a problem. It was about $3 million. And
$3 billion?
$3 million.
$3 million,
with
okay.
an M. $3 million with an M, dollars. And the company made a commitment to make folks whole. No salaries were adjusted down, salaries were only adjusted up, so that we could say if someone's doing the same work at the same level in the same location, that they're paid the same regardless of their gender identity. And that we continue that practice year in and year out, even post an acquisition. So if we acquire a company, we acquire their pay practices and make sure that we're auditing and adjusting the pay of everyone in the company for parity and equity on an annual cadence. So that's the story, and it's powerful, and we just want to be able to plant the flag to say equal pay for equal work, regardless of gender identity.
So when you acquire companies, do you often see the same practices that existed at Salesforce before? You have to invest more money to kind of right the historic wrong?
You know, it differs from company to company, naturally. And so we have seen some differences, and we make sure on that annual cadence that we go back in and we adjust to make things right.
Well, I want to talk about when the rubber meets the road and when you run into resistance. Tim, you deal with CEOs all the time. There's a lot of good intentions out there. But you're also cognizant of not pushing things too much because you think it's better to have people on board rather than alienate them. Can you talk about your juggling act and a recent conversation you had that you spoke to me about?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So look, one of the things that is clear is that most CEOs generally do care in our experience. So it's rare that you run across someone who is just paying pure lip service to it. Now, the level of intensity can range from company to company. The benefit of CEO Action is we've created a safe place to have the conversations. And the first CEO Action commitment is making our workplaces safe to talk about issues of race or gender or any other underrepresented group. We want and need to make the workplaces safe. And the reason we chose that commitment is because foundational, if you can't talk about pay equity, if you can't talk about gender, then you're never going to get to where you need to get to. That applies to CEOs too. And CEOs, many of them, when we get with them one-on-one, they'll tell us, look, I know I need to do this. I'm not sure I know how. You'd be stunned at how many CEOs don't know what a pay gap is, let alone how to solve it, just know what it is. And so we find ourselves, through CEO Action, through our client relationships, spending a lot of time one-on-one with CEOs. And that's where I've spent a lot of my time over the last couple of years. And one recent conversation, I sat with the CEO and he said, Tim, I signed the pledge, but we're stalling. Like everything we're trying isn't working. And he asked me to spend 3 hours with him. And I spent 3 hours with him where we sat down going in the weeds around how do you set a culture of having a safe place? Like he goes, I signed the commitment, but I don't know what to do. How do I make that happen? So do I send an email? Do I write a memo? Do I have a conference? So we're down in the nuts and bolts of foundationally, how do you create a safe place? We're down in the nuts and bolts of when you're recruiting it's 50-50 women, men, and then you're losing women at 5 times the rate of men. How do you solve that? Why is it? So what we've found is that creating a safe place for everybody, including CEOs, really makes a difference. And one of the things that we're proud of CEO Action is we have a number of opportunities throughout the course of a year to really coach CEOs how to make progress and move beyond what I'll say well-intended here, but to making it happen and get that action going.
Sukhinder, we were talking earlier about good intentions and how you rather reluctantly have grown to embrace the idea of quotas as one of the only ways that's going to get to more equal representation, at least on boards.
Yeah, I think I've certainly, when I started, look, nobody who is a sitting CEO or founder in your bones was like, wow, I want somebody else telling me what to do. Like, I think it's fair for all of us, right? Like if you're in a position of leadership, so you expect autonomy. So the idea when somebody says quota to you, I understand that resistance. I've sat on boards where I'm the only woman. I've sat on boards that are completely gender equal. Ericsson is a Swedish board, obviously a large global telecom company, but lives in the European environment of quotas, where quite frankly, sitting in an equal boardroom, there's just like, you don't even notice gender. It is amazing. Like, I mean, it just becomes a non-issue because the room is so diverse. And obviously the boardrooms I'm not a part of because they have no women on their boards. But what I've come to embrace, and I think this is sort of the frustrating truth about progress overall. We all wish that rational actors made good progress based on data. I would say the history of technology is about disruption. And rightly or wrongly, the Me Too movement has accelerated boardroom diversity, right? Like things, unfortunately, sometimes need to be pushed in ways that aren't great to create, the necessary impetus that you hope that good data would. And so when I look at quotas today, I no longer think of them as evil. I mean, I think there's a gradation, right? There's a gradation that starts with a Rooney Rule equivalent about building a diverse pipeline. And often it takes, as you know, Tim, more than 50%. Because quite frankly, the truth nobody will tell you is women pull out of searches for boards, for executive positions at a faster and bigger rate once they're in the pipeline. So if you want 50-50, you might need to be a pipeline that's 75-25, just based on the ratios. And then up from that is sort of comply or explain. And there are countries around the world that have used comply and explain, Australia, the UK, Canada, which is like report your data as a board. And if you're not meeting kind of increasing gender representation, you have to explain why. And that's working. And then up from that is California and Europe that have done quotas, and in fact, that's working. So I think I'm just no longer black and white. I just think sometimes good intentions fail and disruption works. That's what it takes, that's what it takes.
Can I just add something that we often get asked by CEOs, why is this so important? And they view it almost as a nice to have. And we give similar advice. We say, look, the data around just how to reach your customers and how to attract the best talent is overwhelming. There's plenty of studies out there, plenty of data. If that doesn't get you, it's clearly just the right thing to do to be fully inclusionary. And then we say, if that doesn't get you, somebody's going to make you do it. Yeah. And that's evident in California. You see that in Illinois, not even just within the United States. So here's the funny thing. Our demographics in the United States are changing. And we're seeing that in Congress. We're seeing it in other parts. Inevitably, if companies don't catch up, you like to think they'll lose market share, lose customers, won't get the war for talent. But clearly, we're beginning to see something that is just beginning. Right. And we're going to see more policymakers involved. So there's more of an impetus than ever for all three reasons to make this happen.
Tony, what would you say forces change in diversity? I read somewhere that Salesforce had hired 4,000 women in the past year. I mean, is it sheer numbers? Is it is it Rooney rules? Like, what is your? And I know you're focused on equality and a lot of issues beyond just the workforce. But could you talk about how you're trying to make this happen in an organization that really wants to do the right thing?
Yeah, I'd say several factors. First is culture, and it's been said. I don't know who the original person who said this was, but people go where they're invited, but they stay where they're welcome. And so building a culture where people feel welcome and they feel like they can be their authentic self, and where everyone feels seen and valued and heard, and working deliberately to build that culture. Second is transparency. So I think it's super important for all organizations to be transparent about their representation, for better or for worse. So at Salesforce,
you publicly report?
Is annually we disclose it's 31.6% women at Salesforce. So we have more work to do, but we made progress. 2 years ago, it was 30.1%. Last year, it was 30.9%, right? So we've improved materially, about 150 basis points. So just in the last year, because we're growing at scale, that means 4,000 more women work at Salesforce than did the year prior. The third vector is accountability, and making sure that executives are accountable for the outcomes of their decisions. And so every month, every 30 days, every executive at Salesforce that has more than 30 folks working for them gets a scorecard. What's on the scorecard? How many women work for you today? How many women worked for you 30 days ago? How many women worked for you a year ago today? In the last 30 days, how many women did you hire? How many women did you promote? How many women attrited for any cause? And because we want the whole company right up to the board to look like society, they get a second scorecard, and that's executives. Same litany. How many women, how many you hire, how many attrited, et cetera. So clear accountability, you can see the data, and this is part of what motivates it. When folks see these data, they go, well, Are you proud of these data? Does this look like society? There's inherent motivation. You know, because data, that's the fuel of management and management science.
Sukhinder, I want to talk about the pipeline and what happens to women in the middle. You told a very compelling story of when you were at Google and made quite an extraordinary request to Eric Schmidt to fly, I believe, your child and your nanny around when you had to travel. Could you just give me some context to that and why you think that women really need to pay attention to kind of, and why we all need to pay attention to like the middle of one's career where there's just a lot of attrition?
Sure. So just a little history. I was at Google for 6+ years, and my first year at Google, I was the GM of Local and Maps, as we were just building that product, and I had just gotten married, no issue. Fast forward a year, and I reported the chief business officer, Omid Kordestani, who reported Eric, and Omid offered me the opportunity to build Asia Pacific and Latin America, which at the time was, because Larry and Sergey really wanted international to accelerate. And at the time, it was a relatively small business. But it was the rest of the world. Literally, it was ROW. So there was Europe, and there was ROW. I got ROW at the time. And I had just gotten married. I was in my mid-30s. I don't think I was a VP yet, but to be fair, at Google, I was pretty senior. I was, because at the time, it was still a relatively small organization. I was a senior director and reporting to the chief business officer. And I remember thinking, and my husband was not happy. Like, he was just like, wait, we just got married. We want to have a child, and you're going to take this role. So negotiation number one with my husband a year in to take the role, right? So that's like the negotiation at home. And like, he's not happy, And so I first say to Omid, my first request, which we don't talk about often, is I said to Omid, I was like, hey, you're going to pay for my husband to travel with me a few times a year, right? I just got married. He's like, yeah. So my husband came with me. Brazil, China. I submitted the expense receipts. I'm like, he took them, to his credit. And then I got pregnant, and a couple years passed by, and I'm like, now how do I stay in this job? And I really wanted to. And so I went to Omid, and I said, okay, in order to make this work, I really would like Google to pay for my nanny and my baby to travel with me around the world business class. And Google said yes. And so for the next 2.5 years, everywhere I went, they went. Everywhere. I mean, everywhere. Sales conferences, one-day trips, India, China. I had to relocate to Hong Kong at one point because we were in a dire situation in China. And Google just said yes. But sort of that leads to the point. A couple of things in that period, right? Number one, I don't think we're yet at a place I wish we were. Beyond policies is wishing your boss or others thought about what makes it possible for you to stay in. Yes, we want company CEOs thinking about policies that allow women to stay in. But the converse is, I think for me, it was like, okay, what do I need to put in front of my boss? What do I need to ask for to make this happen? Before I don't ask, because I presume they'll say no, I'm just going to ask. Because the cost to them of me being out of the workforce is actually quite high. The cost of replacing me is there's a time value. I mean, there's all sorts of things. And so when I look at women in the middle, I think when the challenges, and you and I were chatting about this, first of all, not everybody needs to want to do this. That's sort of not my point. My point isn't that everybody has to be leaned in. That's like, it's not the point. But the point is, if you want to think about your career trajectory in these key years where you are a director, so you've hit the management ranks, and now what? The question is, what can you ask for to make it possible to stay in, whatever that may mean? For me, it meant like fully in, but like my family's traveling with me around the world. For others, it may mean like, what is the job share situation? How do I come to work even a day a week? How do I ladder into something that I can manage when I'm caregiving or taking care of a child? What can I do to stay in this period, and what can I ask for? And I think that requires both, of course, it requires inventive processes and practices from your company, but it also requires, I think, more of us to just say, this is what I need. Because in your asking, you ask not just for yourself. You make it possible, and you make sort of people who have good intentions just like you, but are otherwise unaware of the cost, able to respond, and respond not just for you and for others. And I think the reason we talked about this is important is because, unfortunately, in the middle parts of our careers, where you exit is where you enter back. So, this is the challenge, I think many of you know. If you exit as a director, you come back as a director. And meanwhile, your colleagues who've been there and stayed in right? They are on a cycle. And again, that's no discredit to them. I mean, they're on a cycle where every 2 years, particularly in jobs like technology, where the job keeps changing, where their careers are just progressing. So I think it really is important, whatever the definition is of staying in. Again, you don't have to want it, but if you want it, you know, what is that combination of both company policy and system, and what is the sort of, you know what, it's never been invented before, time for me to ask, that may make that possible. But it's going to require inventiveness regardless.
Tim, we see study after study that says that women and men enter the workforce in equal numbers, and there is this attrition all the way to the end. Are you seeing that with the companies that you're working with, and what do you think can be done?
Let me stop it. Yeah, so it's a very common problem. So the study after study shows that, you know, we recruit 50-50, companies start 50-50, and you end up very different. And a lot of it has to do with some of what Sukhinder talked about. But the big question is, it's not one thing. There are a number of things that have to happen. The best practice that we see, it starts with a culture where you can speak up. It's being comfortable enough to ask that question and say, I need something different. The companies that are doing well, number one, they've got the right culture, they've got the environment, they've got a leadership team, a CEO, and that's why we chose CEO action. CEOs have to set the tone here. The CEO is willing to embrace a different environment. So companies that are doing well have a good culture that's enabled by the CEO. The second is they do have good programs and policies in place that support women as they progress throughout their careers, because we know there's different inflection points. The third thing is companies that have a conversation with the men about, number one, why this is so important, number two, the desire to lean in, having the accountability, but also making sure they understand that they're not being left behind as well. I'll tell you very candidly, one of the hardest things I've had to do as we've progressed this at our firm, and we're not perfect, but we've made really good progress, is sitting down with our men and explaining, yes, I understand you wanted that role, we went in this different direction, but here's why it's important, how do we make sure you still stay on board this journey? So companies that are focusing on culture, the right accountability, the right policies, but engaging the majority and helping to get them to be part of the sponsorship, they're making the best progress. Have they solved that problem? No, but they're making relatively the best progress.
Rebecca, one kind of funny thing, or I think that's important and an anecdote to illustrate kind of what we're both talking about. You know, we talk about speaking up. I think the other part of this is inviting the women, and which it could be uncomfortable to have a conversation. And again, sort of just an anecdote, we talk about sort of that traveling around the world story. You know, I'm traveling around the world, all's good. I have to go open the Korea office. Eric Schmidt's coming. Eric's, you know, my boss's boss, and great and very supportive overall. And he invites me to fly on the corporate jet to get to Korea. It's a Friday, and we both need to be in Korea on Monday morning. And I know that I'm traveling with my baby and nanny. And so even though we all know that this is happening, I really don't feel like, you know. So I'm like, Eric, I'm good. I'll see you in Korea on Monday. Leave it. Saturday morning. Sukhinder, would you like to come in the corporate jet? I'm like, I'm good. His admin, Pam, calls me, and she's like, Sukhinder, Eric would love to have the baby and the nanny and you on the company jet. Please come. I was like, great. Arrive on the jet, baby and nanny in hand. He gives me the bedroom, you know. I mean, but the entire, like, even with him, like, I'd negotiate. I was uncomfortable bringing up the idea. I'm like, okay, it's one thing to ask for it. It's another thing to, like, have him
broadcast.
That's how we see it.
But the fact that he and Pam intuited, and like, it just invited and made me feel comfortable.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that set a lot of the tone for, you know, how I would like to be as a leader with my own men and women and their ability to talk about these issues with me.
Before we go to questions quickly, I want to, Tony, ask you about transgender inclusion. You work on this a lot in your life, and you have a personal story involving your son, and I'd love you to share it with us.
Well, I've been on this incredible journey with my son, and I started in high school and went on through college, and you know, this chapter of the story, my son just graduated from college this year. But when my son started college, my son gave me this pen. And this was 3.5 years ago, my son gave me this pen, and it simply says on there, Ally. And it's for the Amherst College, the Queer Resource Center for Amherst College. And my son said, put this on today. And there's something super powerful when somebody asks you to be your ally. And versus making this, you know, silent declaration in your mind, oh, I'm your ally, but then there's a headwind or a controversy and you're silent, you don't stand up. Versus making a public declaration is super, super meaningful that you're that person's ally, and that it empowers them and it holds you accountable. So that's been truly, truly important. You know, it's an important issue, and you look at the folks who are often most marginalized in today's society, whose voices aren't heard, are often transgender people of color. You see this in the statistics, homeless statistics, many, many statistics. And so I think it's an important community to stand up for. I think it's important to stand up for the entire LGBTQ community, as well as folks of all different identities. And for me, this has been part of my personal mission and one of the reasons why I ended up in this job. Just one brief anecdote. I saw Salesforce standing up for LGBTQ rights in Indiana. I did not work for Salesforce. And I'm saying, Salesforce is opening those doors. They're opening those doors literally for my family. And wouldn't it be great to work for a company like that? And by fate or luck, or divine intervention, here I am.
We have run out of time. There's so many great discussion points. So thank you to my panelists. And